I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would betray the man I loved. But life has a way of throwing you into situations where everything you thought you knew about yourself gets turned upside down. I always believed in honesty, in loyalty, and in the kind of love that could withstand anything. But that was before I met Michael and before I found myself tangled in a web of lies that I never saw coming. I met David when we were both in college. He was studying engineering, and I was pursuing a degree in psychology. We were introduced by a mutual friend at a party, and from the moment we started talking, I felt a connection with him. He was smart, funny, and had this quiet confidence that drew me in. We started dating soon after, and before I knew it, we were inseparable. We had a great relationship, at least, that's what I thought. After graduation, we moved in together, and life seemed to be falling into place. David got a job at a tech company, and I started working as a counselor at a local clinic. Our days were busy, but we always made time for each other. We had our routines, our inside jokes, and our shared dreams of what the future would hold. It was comfortable, stable, and I was content. But then, everything changed when I met Michael. It was a typical Friday afternoon at the clinic, and I was finishing up my last session of the day. I was tired, ready to go home and unwind with David, but there was one more appointment on my schedule, a new client. I didn't think much of it as I reviewed his file. He was a young man in his early 30s who had recently gone through a rough breakup. It seemed straightforward enough, and I figured I'd help him work through the pain and move on. When Michael walked into my office, I was taken aback. He was tall, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. He had an air of quiet intensity about him, and from the moment he sat down, I could tell that there was more to his story than what was written in his file. Our first session was tense, filled with awkward silences and hesitant answers. Michael was guarded, clearly not comfortable opening up to a stranger, and I did my best to create a safe space for him. But there was something about him that intrigued me, something that made me want to understand him better. He wasn't like my other clients. There was a depth to his pain that I couldn't quite put my finger on. As the weeks went by, Michael began to open up more. He talked about his breakup, how it had blindsided him, how he had thought he was going to marry this woman, only for her to leave him for someone else. He was angry, hurt, and lost, and I found myself empathizing with him in a way that I hadn't with other clients. I told myself it was just part of the job, that I was supposed to care, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I started looking forward to our sessions, to the way Michael would look at me when he talked, as if I was the only person in the world who could understand him. I found myself thinking about him outside of work, wondering how he was doing, what he was thinking. It was dangerous, and I knew it, but I couldn't stop myself. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, Michael asked if I wanted to grab a coffee. It was against every rule I had set for myself as a counselor, but before I could think it through, I found myself saying yes. We walked to a nearby cafe, and for the first time, our conversation felt easy, natural, like two old friends catching up. We talked about everything, our favorite books, movies, our hopes for the future. It was like a breath of fresh air, and I found myself laughing more than I had in months. As the sun began to set, I realized how late it was and that I should have been home hours ago. But I didn't want the evening to end. I didn't want to go back to my life with David, to the routine that suddenly felt suffocating. I should get going, I said, though I didn't mean it. Michael looked at me, his eyes searching mine. Yeah, I guess so, he replied, but he didn't make a move to leave. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the tension between us palpable. I knew I should walk away, that I should go home to David and pretend that this never happened. But I couldn't. There was something about Michael that drew me in, something that made me want to take the risk. Can I see you again? He asked, his voice low and tentative. My heart skipped a beat, and I knew that I was standing at a crossroads. I could say no, walk away, and save myself from the mess I was about to create. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes. We exchanged numbers, and as I walked home, I felt a mix of excitement and guilt churning in my stomach. I knew what I was doing was wrong, that I was crossing a line that I could never uncross. But the thought of not seeing Michael again, of going back to the life I had with David, felt unbearable. Over the next few weeks, Michael and I began seeing each other more often. It started with coffee, then lunch, then dinners that lasted late into the night. We talked about everything, his life, his fears, his dreams, and slowly, I began to share more about myself. I told him things I had never told David, things I had kept buried deep inside. It was liberating, intoxicating, and I found myself falling for him in a way that scared me. But with every step I took towards Michael, I felt myself pulling away from David. I started avoiding him, making excuses to stay late at work or go out with friends. I couldn't bring myself to look him in the eye, knowing that I was betraying him in the worst way possible. The guilt gnawed at me, but it wasn't enough to stop me from seeing Michael. One evening, as Michael and I sat in a dimly lit restaurant, he reached across the table and took my hand. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I can't keep pretending that this is just friendship. I want more, but I don't want to push you into something you're not ready for." His words hit me like a ton of bricks, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I knew what he was asking, what he wanted, and I knew that I was on the verge of making a decision that would change everything. "I care about you, Michael," I said, my voice trembling. "But this is complicated. I'm with David, and I can't just walk away from that." Michael nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know. But I can't keep seeing you like this, knowing that you're going home to someone else. It's tearing me apart." The pain in his voice was almost too much to bear, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to lose Michael, but I couldn't bring myself to hurt David either. I was trapped, caught between two men who meant the world to me. "I need time," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to figure out what I want." Michael nodded, though I could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. But just know that I'm here, waiting for you." With that, we parted ways, and as I walked home, the weight of my decision pressed down on me like a heavy burden. I knew that I couldn't keep living like this, torn between two worlds, but I didn't know how to make a choice without losing something, or someone, important to me. When I got home that night, David was sitting on the couch, watching TV. He looked up as I walked in, his face lighting up with a smile that made my heart ache. "Hey, there you are," he said, his voice warm and welcoming. "I was starting to wonder if you'd gotten lost." I forced a smile, trying to push down the guilt that was threatening to consume me. "Sorry, I got caught up at work," I lied, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. He patted the spot next to him on the couch. "Come sit with me. I ordered your favorite pizza." I hesitated, the weight of everything I had been hiding from him making it hard to breathe. But I couldn't let him see what was going on inside me. I couldn't let him see the mess I had created. "Sure," I said, my voice barely above a whisper as I sat down next to him. As we ate pizza and watched TV, I couldn't help but feel like I was living someone else's life. The woman sitting on that couch, laughing at the jokes on the screen and cuddling up to David, wasn't me. Or at least, it wasn't who I had become. I felt like a stranger in my own home, and the realization made me feel sick to my stomach. Over the next few days, I tried to distance myself from both Michael and David, hoping that some time alone would help me figure out what I wanted. But the more time I spent by myself, the more confused I became. I couldn't imagine my life without David, without the stability and comfort that he provided. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the pull I felt towards Michael, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I found myself avoiding Michael's calls and texts, not because I didn't want to talk to him, but because I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to lead him on, didn't want to give him false hope, but I also didn't want to push him away. I was stuck, trapped in a limbo of my own making, and I didn't know how to get out. And then, one evening, everything came crashing down. I was at home, sitting on the couch and trying to distract myself with a book when there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was surprised when I opened it to find Michael standing there, his face pale and his eyes filled with determination. "Michael," I said, my voice filled with a mix of surprise and fear. "What are you doing here?" "I had to see you," he replied, his voice firm. "I can't keep waiting around, hoping that you'll make a decision. I need to know where we stand." His words sent a jolt of fear through me, and I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting David to walk into the room at any moment. "You shouldn't be here," I whispered, my voice trembling. "David's home." "I don't care," Michael said, his voice filled with resolve. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of pretending that this isn't real. I love you, and I need to know if you feel the same way." His words hit me like a ton of bricks, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had been avoiding this moment, hoping that I could somehow keep both men in my life without having to choose. But I knew that wasn't possible. I knew that I had to make a decision, and I had to make it now. "I care about you, Michael," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "But I can't just walk away from David. He means too much to me." Michael's face fell, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "So, that's it then? You're choosing him?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so confused, and I don't know what to do." Before Michael could respond, I heard footsteps behind me, and I turned to see David standing in the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of suspicion and pain. "Who is this?" My heart dropped into my stomach, and for a moment, I felt like the world was closing in around me. This was it, the moment I had been dreading, the moment when everything would come crashing down. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen." David's face hardened, and I could see the realization dawning on him. "How long?" he asked, his voice cold and distant. "How long has this been going on?" I couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't bring myself to answer. The guilt was overwhelming, and I felt like I was drowning in it. "Answer me," David demanded, his voice filled with anger. "Just a few weeks," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. "It's not what you think, David. I didn't mean for it to happen." David shook his head, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and hurt. "You lied to me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You've been lying to me this whole time." "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm so sorry." But my apology did nothing to ease the pain on David's face. He looked at me, his eyes filled with betrayal, before turning and walking out of the room. I stood there, my heart breaking as I watched him go, knowing that I had just lost the one person who had always been there for me. I had betrayed him in the worst way possible, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of the life I had shattered. Michael reached out to me, his hand gently touching my arm. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." I shook my head, pulling away from him. "This is all my fault," I said, my voice filled with regret. "I should have never let it get this far." Michael looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. "Maybe it's better this way," he said quietly. "Maybe now we can figure out what we really want." But I didn't know what I wanted anymore. The life I had with David was over, and the possibility of something with Michael felt tainted by the betrayal that had brought us together. I didn't know if I could ever forgive myself for what I had done, and I didn't know if I could ever move forward with Michael without being haunted by the guilt of how we had come together. "I need time," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I need to figure out who I am without you, without David." Michael nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "I'll be here, waiting for you." But as I watched him walk out of my apartment, I couldn't help but feel that there was no going back, no fixing the mess I had created. I had betrayed the man I loved, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been shattered by my own choices. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. David moved out of our apartment, leaving me alone with the weight of my guilt and regret. I couldn't bring myself to reach out to him, knowing that I had hurt him in a way that I could never take back. And as for Michael, I avoided his calls and texts, not because I didn't care about him, but because I didn't know how to move forward. I spent most of my days alone, lost in my thoughts, trying to make sense of the mess I had created. I replayed every moment in my mind, wondering where I had gone wrong, how I had let things spiral so far out of control. I didn't have any answers, and the uncertainty of it all was suffocating. One evening, as I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Michael. "I miss you. Can we talk?" I stared at the message, my heart aching with a mix of emotions, guilt, longing, fear. I knew that I needed to talk to him, to figure out where we stood, but I wasn't sure if I was ready. But before I could make a decision, there was a knock at my door. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a surge of anxiety as I stood up to answer it. When I opened the door, I found David standing there, his face pale and his eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "David," I said, my voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to talk to you," he replied, his voice soft. I needed to understand why. The pain in his voice was almost too much to bear, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." David looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and confusion. "But it did happen," he said quietly. "And now we have to figure out what comes next." I nodded, knowing that he was right. We couldn't go back to the way things were, but we also couldn't keep living in this limbo of pain and uncertainty. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let him in. We sat on the couch, the same couch where we had spent so many evenings together, watching movies and laughing. But now, the air between us was heavy with tension, with everything that had been left unsaid. "Why?" David asked finally, his voice trembling with emotion. "Why did you do it?" I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I was lost, and I didn't know how to find my way back. Michael, he made me feel something that I hadn't felt in a long time. But that doesn't excuse what I did. "I betrayed you, and I'm so sorry." David was silent for a long time, and I could see the battle raging inside him, the struggle between the love he still felt for me and the pain of my betrayal. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said finally, his voice filled with a mix of sadness and regret. "But I also don't know if I can walk away from you." His words hit me like a ton of bricks, and I felt tears streaming down my face. I didn't deserve his forgiveness, didn't deserve the chance to make things right. But I wanted it, more than anything. "I want to try," I said, my voice trembling. "I want to make things right, if you'll let me." David looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and hope. "It's going to take time," he said quietly. "And I don't know if we'll ever get back to where we were. But I'm willing to try, if you are." I nodded, my heart filled with a mix of relief and fear. I knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but I also knew that I was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. As David reached out and took my hand, I felt a glimmer of hope, a small light in the darkness that had consumed us. It wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like there was a way forward. And as I sat there, holding David's hand, I realized that the choices I had made had changed everything, but they didn't have to define the rest of my life. There was still a chance to make things right, to rebuild what had been broken. But it would take time, and it would take both of us being willing to face the pain, the guilt, and the uncertainty. And as I looked into David's eyes, I knew that I was ready to try. For the first time in a long time, I felt like there was hope for the future. It wouldn't be easy, but we had a chance to start over, to rebuild, to find our way back to each other. And that was enough.